A faded photograph, discovered in the corner of an aging antique shop, appeared harmless at first glance. Just three boys on a garden bench, dressed neatly, smiling easily, offering a glimpse of quiet childhood simplicity. But something in the image felt wrong, a subtle tension lingering beneath the smiles, as if one boy's expression carried a secret he'd learned to hide, a truth pressed into him long before the shutter ever clicked. Behind the innocent setting lay scars almost invisible in the sepia tones, faint marks around a young wrist that hinted at restraint, obedience, and suffering carefully disguised beneath polished clothing and posed companionship. What began as a curiosity soon became an obsession for the man who found the photograph, drawing him into a buried history of power, control, and a childhood fractured by chains that no carefully staged portrait could ever truly conceal. If you're drawn to hidden histories, human resilience, and stories where a single overlooked detail unravels an entire illusion, you're in the right place. Subscribe, stay curious, and join us as we uncover truths long buried beneath silence and dust. The date on the back lingered in his mind like a quiet warning, a reminder that the world captured in the frame belonged to another era, one where appearances often masked realities carved painfully into young lives. He carefully angled the image toward the window, letting natural light sweep across its surface. Details sharpened instantly. The central boy's posture tightened further, a subtle flinch preserved forever, impossible to dismiss once finally noticed. If the photograph had been staged to appear warm and harmonious, it failed under scrutiny. Every gentle gesture around the central boy felt rehearsed, crafted to portray a quality where none truly existed beneath the surface. The more he studied the image, the more chilling its implications became. The outer boys appeared entirely at ease, unaware of the silent narrative pressed into the third boy's skin, a narrative stronger than any post-affection. He felt the familiar weight of discovery settling across his chest, that sensation researchers experience when quiet evidence contradicts accepted stories. The photograph demanded attention, whispered contradictions, and revealed truths intentionally hidden within delicate silvered glass. He set the frame gently on a cleared section of the counter, steadying his breath. The shopkeeper glanced over briefly, uninterested, unaware that the quiet artifact resting there carried a history capable of unraveling illusions. Outside, car engines hummed faintly, but inside the shop everything felt still. The moment stretched, filled with the gravity of recognition. This image wasn't simply old. It was deliberately constructed to disguise something far more disturbing. He touched the edge of the frame again, feeling the cool metal beneath his fingertips. The craftsmanship suggested wealth, privilege, and intention, as if whoever commissioned the portrait wanted to capture more than a pleasant childhood memory. But those faint wrist marks told another story entirely. They whispered of control, restriction, and discipline maintained through force. They clashed violently with the polite arrangement of clothing, posture, and supposed companionship. He imagined the photographer adjusting the boys' positions, perhaps encouraging smiles, urging them to lean closer. Yet only two of the boys could offer genuine ease, while the third carried tension impossible to hide completely. The investigator's pulse quickened. He had seen many historical images, but rarely one so carefully constructed to project affection while concealing evidence of enforced obedience. The duality struck him with unsettling clarity. He knew immediately that the photograph was significant, not because of the boy's clothing or the ornate bench, but because the truth resisted erasure. The marks on those wrists refused to remain silent beneath the sepia tones. He purchased the photograph without hesitation, barely hearing the shopkeeper's casual comment about old frames selling slowly. The investigator slipped the image into a protective sleeve, handling it with a reverence usually reserved for fragile testimonies. Stepping outside, he blinked against the sunlight, the weight of the find pressing onto his shoulders. The world around him felt painfully ordinary, unchanged by the revelation he carried tucked carefully under his arm. He unlocked his car and sat for a moment, letting the stillness settle. The photograph lay on the passenger's seat, angled slightly, the boys' expressions visible enough to feel their uneasy conflict even from a distance. He picked it up again, holding it closer, letting the daylight reveal every hidden detail. The central boy's eyes looked brighter now, sharpened by truth, heavy with something he could no longer mistake for simple weariness. The investigator zoomed in with his phone's camera, capturing high-resolution images. Magnification exposed the marks with absolute clarity. No flaw in the print, no trick of aging. These were scars born of metal pressed harshly into skin. His stomach tightened. The photograph wasn't a record of friendship. It was documentation presented as tenderness, meant to soften the reality surrounding the central boy's forced presence among companions who lived entirely different lives. He thought about the countless images from that era, portraits designed to comfort those who held power while hiding the pain endured by those positioned quietly beside them. This one, however, failed to conceal everything. He rested the photograph against the steering wheel, absorbing the weight of responsibility settling over him. Every detail demanded investigation. Every contradiction begged to be unraveled. History had left breadcrumbs. He intended to follow them relentlessly. The central boy's forced smile lingered in his thoughts. It looked crafted to appease, shaped by someone else's expectations, formed not by joy but by necessity. An expression learned through survival rather than shared innocence. He imagined the boy preparing for the portrait, adjusting clothing not chosen by him, coached quietly to stand still, sit properly, smile gently. The invisible pressure behind that practiced expression seemed to echo through time. He felt anger rising, not sharp but deep, directed at the unseen hands that shaped the photograph's narrative. Whoever orchestrated the scene had tried to immortalize a lie, confident it would never be questioned. That confidence faltered now. The truth leaked through the smallest details, resisted burial, and surfaced through the faintest scars. The investigator felt compelled to honor that truth by uncovering everything the image attempted to hide. He started the engine, determination settling into his bones. The photograph was no longer just an object. It had become a responsibility, a thread connecting him to a boy whose silence had been enforced and exploited. As he pulled onto the road, sunlight flashed across the photograph again, illuminating the central boy's wrists with a clarity impossible to ignore. The marks, once nearly invisible, now seemed to shout through the decades. The investigator understood then that the journey ahead would not be simple. The truth rarely was. But he also knew that every buried story began with a spark, one detail capable of collapsing entire illusions built across generations. With the photograph resting beside him like a fragile witness, he drove toward his office, already planning the research that would consume his coming days. He owed that boy a name, a history, and a voice. Whatever the cost, he would find it. The scars demanded nothing less. Back in his office, the investigator placed the photograph beneath bright lamps, watching hidden textures emerge through intensified light. Every shadow sharpened, every blemish stood out, and the central boy's wrist scars revealed themselves with unsettling precision. He transferred the cleaned image to his computer, magnifying it until individual grains of silver dust appeared. The boy's expression, once subtle, now carried unmistakable conflict, a mixture of obedience, fear, and exhausted resignation shaped through lived experience. The investigator opened archives he'd used many times before, databases filled with forgotten records, faint names, and stray details preserved through chance rather than compassion. He searched by date, city, photographer, clothing style, and every identifier salvageable from the photograph. Photographer logs surfaced first, revealing the studio responsible for capturing the image. The entries listed countless wealthy clients seeking portraits of their sons, usually surrounded by symbols of status and prosperity. Yet none mentioned three boys posed closely together. He read deeper, finding notes about seasonal commissions from affluent households accustomed to documenting their lineage. The descriptions painted images of families shaping legacy through carefully choreographed moments, always hoping to frame themselves as benevolent guardians of propriety and wealth. The investigator leaned back, considering the boys flanking the central figure. Their posture and clothing suggested privilege shaped from birth, their confidence reflected in relaxed shoulders and natural ease. They embodied sons raised to expect comfort without consequence. In contrast, the central boy's manner revealed something different. His alignment on the bench felt cautious, as though he'd learned to anticipate orders before they were spoken. His smile offered compliance rather than joy, a gesture honed through constant supervision. The investigator opened census ledgers, tracing households whose property holdings matched the era's power structures. Names repeated across pages: landowners, merchants, and men whose wealth depended on labor extracted through force. Among them, he sought families with 3 boys of similar age. He combed through property lists detailing the number of individuals forced to work under each household, the notations chillingly impersonal. Male figures identified only by approximate age, physical condition, or financial value. It was a ledger of human lives reduced to assets. The investigator cross-referenced ages, hoping to locate a boy whose description aligned with the one seated in the photograph. Slowly, patterns surfaced. Certain families kept detailed records, while others wrote only what served their economic interests or affirmed their controlled narratives. He found one entry describing a youthful attendant assigned to accompany 2 privileged sons during lessons and leisure. The role's phrasing disturbed him. It presented forced companionship as if it were an honor, masking exploitation beneath controlled language. That single entry pulled him forward. It hinted at proximity between the boys, an enforced closeness likely mirrored in the portrait. The central boy was not a friend, but a tool shaped to serve the brothers' comfort and amusement. He noted additional comments regarding the boy's demeanor, praising obedience, but warning of restlessness common among young attendants. The term suggested attempts at independence, punished swiftly to maintain order. The wrist scars now made devastating sense within this context. The investigator printed relevant pages, spreading them across his desk. They formed a fragmented map of a childhood shaped by restriction. Each document, each phrase, painted another brushstroke in the portrait of a boy silenced by circumstance. He imagined the burden placed on that child, the duty to entertain privileged sons, follow their movements, endure their world's expectations, and appear grateful while carrying wounds hidden beneath carefully pressed sleeves and polished shoes chosen for the portrait. This enforced companionship allowed the privileged boys to believe they were generous, oblivious to the suffering shaping the central boy's days. Their comfort relied on his compliance, and the portrait attempted to immortalize that imbalance as harmonious brotherhood. The investigator understood that identifying the boy's name would require immersing himself deeper into the archives. Many children in his position were never named in official ledgers, referred to only through roles rather than identities reflecting their humanity. He pushed further, scanning stacks of estate documents. These records, though coldly administrative, often contained glimpses of individual lives. In them, he found references to boys assigned to household duties, each entry framed through valuation rather than recognition. One notation stood out for its chilling specificity. It described a boy fitted with restraints following an attempted flight. The record mentioned marks left upon his wrists, scarring consistent with sustained binding, the very wounds captured within the photograph's frame. The investigator felt his pulse surge. This detail aligned perfectly with the central boy's injuries. The record provided timeline, age, and context, transforming the photograph from speculation into undeniable documentation of forced suffering disguised beneath a staged smile. He placed the photograph beside the ledger entry, feeling an almost physical connection between the 2 artifacts. The boy, once anonymous within history's shadows, was now emerging slowly from obscurity, pulled forward by surviving traces of truth. He imagined the moment restraints were applied, the fear the boy must have felt, the sting of metal pressing into young skin. The scars were not accidental reminders. They were permanent imprints of punishment inflicted to maintain control. Determined, the investigator resumed digging. Additional notes revealed the boy's responsibilities included accompanying the household sons during study sessions, outdoor play, and formal gatherings. He was present constantly, required to behave as companion, yet treated as possession. He paused, letting the magnitude settle. This wasn't simple cruelty, it was psychological conditioning. Forcing the boy into proximity with those granted freedom meant shaping him into a living reminder of his own confinement. Every interaction reinforced by imbalance. The investigator realized the photograph exemplified this manipulation. It attempted to cast equality where none existed, capturing a constructed moment designed to hide the violence shaping the boy's everyday life. The portrait was evidence masquerading as innocence. He printed more documents, arranging them chronologically across his table. A faint outline of the boy's life appeared. Tasks assigned, punishments administered, attempts to assert independence crushed swiftly. His existence had been controlled, monitored, and shaped entirely by men in power. The investigator traced the timeline forward until he discovered a final devastating line, a transaction record marking the boy's relocation. He'd been sold to another household several miles away, severing every connection he'd known, even those forged through forced proximity. The weight of that sentence pressed heavily on him. The photograph had captured the boy during a fragile window, moments before his world changed again through decisions made without his consent. The image became even more haunting under this realization. He lifted the photograph, studying the central boy's face once more. The expression held layers, a child's endurance, a practiced mask, a hint of quiet defiance resisting complete suppression. He felt the boy's story reaching through time with tremor-like urgency. The investigator whispered a promise into the stillness of his office. He would find the boy's name, restore his identity, and ensure his experiences were no longer buried beneath curated narratives crafted to protect those who held authority. He gathered the documents, scanned them carefully, and saved digital backups. The truth demanded preservation. With each new detail recovered, the central boy became less of an enigma and more of a voice finally beginning to be heard again. This was no longer an academic pursuit. It had become a responsibility, a moral obligation to resurrect a truth deliberately obscured. The boy deserved recognition, acknowledgement, and the dignity stripped from him by the men who controlled his early years. With renewed resolve, the investigator stood, ready to pursue the next lead. The boy's life had left traces scattered across decades. He intended to follow each one until the story concealed behind that carefully staged photograph finally stood complete. The investigator returned to the scattered records, tracing the privileged boys' trajectories. Their names appeared effortlessly across school lists, property transfers, and society announcements, as if the world had always been prepared to remember them clearly. He followed their paths through photographs showing birthdays, hunting trips, and academic milestones. Their faces aged gradually across preserved albums, each image reflecting stability shaped by inherited authority. Their futures seemed carved in stone long before adulthood arrived. Every document concerning them radiated comfort. Letters discussing travel, expenses covered without hesitation, and opportunities handed down through generations. Their lives unfolded predictably, sheltered from consequence, protected by a structure that had always favored men born into wealth. In contrast, the central boy's existence dissolved into fragmented notes and transactional entries. After his forced relocation, the records grew faint, his presence reduced to a line here or a notation there, slipping steadily into enforced obscurity. The investigator studied these contrasts with growing unease. The privileged boys moved through life collecting accolades, while the boy they once sat beside had been shifted like currency, removed from view, and stripped of recognition by powerful hands. He imagined how the brothers remembered the central boy, if they remembered him at all. Perhaps they recalled him only as a childhood helper, someone present but never acknowledged fully, a figure blurred by convenience and selective memory. Photographs of the brothers as young men revealed confidence shaped by entitlement. Their expressions radiated assurance, the kind nurtured by a lifetime of compliance from those around them. None of these later images betrayed any lingering thought of the lost boy. The investigator compared these portraits with the earlier photograph. The differences were striking. The brothers flourished without restriction, untouched by the conditions that scarred the central boy's wrists and shaped his guarded posture during that summer portrait session. He sifted through letters written by the brothers during adolescence. They mentioned school frustrations, weather complaints, and minor social troubles, but never acknowledged the central boy's suffering or the circumstances that had driven him to flee once before. One letter referenced the boy who used to accompany us, described with a casual detachment that deepened the investigator's frustration. The writer expressed mild curiosity, as though reflecting on misplaced furniture rather than a human life wrenched apart. The investigator felt the disparity tightening around him. Two boys moved confidently through adulthood, celebrated and supported, while the third endured consequences imposed by men who believed their authority righteous. History recorded victories for some and silence for others. He realized the photograph functioned intentionally as propaganda. It attempted to capture false harmony, presenting the central boy as integrated into the brothers' world despite evidence of power imbalance etched into his very skin. With each uncovered document, the truth sharpened. The brothers walked paths paved by inherited advantage, while the central boy faced uncertainty, labor, and punishment from men who viewed him as property rather than a developing mind worthy of respect. The investigator imagined the moment the central boy was separated permanently from the brothers. While they continued their structured routines, he was transported elsewhere, forced into another environment where he had no allies or familiar faces. That moment marked the fracture between lives that once shared proximity. The brothers' days progressed uninterrupted, but the central boy likely entered harsher conditions, possibly under men who enforced discipline with even less restraint than before. The investigator studied regional records surrounding the boy's new location. The farms and households there were notorious for demanding backbreaking labor from young boys, valuing physical endurance above everything else, leaving little room for innocence or recovery. He pictured the boy stepping onto unfamiliar land, wrists still tender, restraints likely removed only when deemed unnecessary. Each new demand would have reinforced his position, teaching him quickly that survival required silence and rapid obedience. The disparities became overwhelming. While the brothers matured into respected men, celebrated for leadership or business, the central boy labored anonymously under the authority of those who exploited his youth for profit and control. The investigator glanced again at the photograph, now printed in enlarged detail on his wall. The two privileged boys smiled openly, unaware of the suffering beside them. The central boy smiled because survival demanded it, not because joy invited it. He wondered whether the brothers ever questioned why the central boy's clothes sometimes fit poorly or why his eyes held exhaustion. Perhaps they noticed, but lacked the perspective to understand. Privilege often blinds those shaped entirely by comfort. Even if they sensed something was wrong, nothing in their upbringing encouraged resistance. They had been raised within a hierarchy where obedience meant order, and questioning that order threatened the foundations of everything they inherited. The investigator traced the brothers into adulthood. Their names appeared on committees, business listings, and social rosters. They owned land, wrote formal letters, and passed down property to sons who inherited their confidence without ever confronting uncomfortable truths. He compared this to the central boy's limited records. After his relocation, documentation became sparse. The investigator found no further mention of his early role, no acknowledgement from those who once commanded his presence daily. This absence struck harder than any physical evidence. Silence created by those in power inflicted wounds just as lasting as scars. Erasure completed the violence begun by restraints, burying a childhood under layers of intentional forgetting. The investigator pressed forward, determined to reconstruct the boy's path. Eventually, he located a distant ledger describing an adolescent laborer resembling the boy's recorded age. It hinted at grueling work and discipline enforced through constant oversight. Life for the central boy diverged drastically from those he once sat beside. While the brothers inherited structured futures, he inherited burden, exhaustion, and struggle shaped by decisions he never had the power to influence or refuse. The investigator understood now that the photograph captured the final moment their worlds touched. After that frame was taken, their lives separated completely, one branch flourishing under privilege, the other enduring hardship with diminishing hope. Yet the photograph survived. It bridged the gulf between these diverged lives, preserving evidence of a moment misrepresented deliberately. It allowed the investigator to trace a truth the original subjects never intended to reveal. He felt compelled to restore balance by uncovering every hidden detail. The diverging trajectories demanded comparison, demanded recognition of the injustice captured in that moment. The boy in the center deserved restitution through truth, if nothing else. The investigator gathered his notes, preparing for the next stage of his search. He felt the story tightening, pulling him toward its unresolved core. What remained missing was not a timeline, but a name that would complete everything. With the photograph glowing under the lamp beside him, he whispered that name would be found. The diverged paths would be documented honestly, and the boy whose life had been pushed into silence would finally be placed at the center. The investigator pressed deeper into scattered archives, determined to recover the boy's identity. Every document, every marginal note, felt like a fragile thread leading towards someone history had tried relentlessly to push into permanent silence. He revisited relocation records, cross-checking ages, conditions, and assignments. Slowly, fragments aligned into a clearer outline of the boy's life after separation. Each small discovery strengthened the fragile bridge connecting his past to the present. One registry mentioned an adolescent laborer sharing the boy's approximate age and description. Though brief, it offered confirmation that he had survived the transition into his new environment, enduring work shaped by exhaustion rather than opportunity or guidance. The investigator studied the entry repeatedly, sensing dignity within its sparse details. Even stripped of identity, the boy's existence resisted disappearance. His presence lingered through ink strokes left unintentionally by men who never intended to preserve his humanity. Determined to push further, the investigator contacted regional historians familiar with overlooked archives. Several responded with eagerness, sharing ledgers and private collections seldom examined. Among these, he located a family record describing a young servant transferred from another household. This servant's name stopped him entirely. The document identified him as a boy called Samuel, roughly matching age, physical description, and circumstances. Everything aligned with the trajectory the investigator had been following relentlessly through countless fragmented records. He printed the page, staring at the name repeatedly. Samuel, the boy who once sat between two privileged companions, now had something more than scars and silence to represent him. He had a name carved into documentation that refused to disappear. The investigator returned to the photograph with renewed reverence. Seeing the central boy's face while knowing his name changed everything. The image became heavier, filled with personal weight rather than anonymous tragedy shaped solely by circumstance. He whispered the name aloud, letting it fill the room. The sound carried a strange resonance, as though the photograph had been waiting decades for someone willing to speak the truth it concealed behind crafted smiles. Driven by the discovery, he traced Samuel's name through additional registries. Soon a pattern emerged. Samuel continued working under demanding conditions, performing labor that required strength exceeding his small frame. His struggle echoed through brief descriptions scattered across ledgers. One document mentioned wrist scars visible during inspection. The detail confirmed what the investigator already knew from the photograph. Samuel carried his history openly on his skin, each mark permanently etched by the metal restraint that shaped his childhood. Another record referenced Samuel's attempts to assert autonomy, interpreted as defiance by the men controlling his environment. Each attempt resulted in further discipline, revealing resilience beneath apparent compliance. He refused to surrender completely, despite overwhelming constraints. The investigator studied these entries, recognizing emerging threads of identity where history offered almost none. Samuel had been treated as property, but his persistence carved traces that survived beyond the intentions of those who controlled him. He contacted genealogical researchers, hoping Samuel's story extended beyond adolescence. Months of searching led to a breakthrough. Records describing a grown man bearing the same name, same birth estimate, and scars noted by a medical examiner decades later. This adult Samuel lived far from the estate where he had first appeared. He worked difficult jobs, moved frequently, and carried physical evidence of his youth. Yet he survived, navigating a world that offered him little but exhaustion. The investigator found photographs of this older Samuel, each portrait shaped by hard years. His expression remained stern yet unwavering, his wrists deliberately displayed, as though insisting the world acknowledge what had been done to him long ago. These portraits felt like reclamation. By revealing his scars, Samuel refused the false narrative created by the earlier photograph. He rejected the illusion of harmony and exposed the reality those privileged men had tried to bury beneath curated images. The investigator placed the childhood photograph beside the adult portraits. The contrast struck him deeply. The boy who once smiled under pressure had grown into a man unwilling to hide the trauma forced upon him by powerful hands. He realized these images formed Samuel's true legacy, not the staged moment crafted by others, but the unfiltered expression preserved in adulthood, shaped by determination rather than obedience. It was a story of survival carved through silence. The investigator contacted living descendants connected through sparse genealogical lines. To his astonishment, they responded immediately, sharing oral histories carried through generations. They spoke of a grandfather who insisted his scars never be forgotten. One descendant described Samuel's determination to ensure no one mistook his childhood for comfort. He had spoken openly of deception, forced performance, and the cruelty lurking behind polished appearances. His truth became a family inheritance passed carefully downward. Hearing these stories stirred something profound in the investigator. Samuel's resilience had survived through memory, refusing erasure despite decades of structured forgetting. The photograph had attempted to silence him, but his descendants ensured the truth endured. The investigator collaborated with them to reconstruct Samuel's life fully. They gathered testimonies, records, and preserved objects. Together, they rebuilt a childhood broken by control, a youth shaped by violence, and an adulthood marked by remarkable endurance. He prepared an exhibition dedicated to Samuel's memory, centered around the photograph that once tried to disguise suffering as innocence. Now the image would expose everything it attempted to hide, transformed from deception into testimony. The central display featured Samuel's name engraved beneath the photograph. Visitors could trace his journey from coerced childhood companionship to resilient adulthood. Every detail challenged the polished narrative crafted by men who benefited from his silence. The investigator watched as visitors studied Samuel's portrait. Many lingered at the contrast between the forced smile of childhood and the unwavering gaze of adulthood. The two images formed a powerful truth rendered impossible to ignore. He realized then that Samuel had never been forgotten entirely. His story lived through descendants, scars, and scattered documents. Each fragment preserved a truth powerful enough to rupture the comfortable illusions surrounding the photograph. The exhibition expanded further, showcasing other boys whose stories mirrored Samuel's. Their lives, once minimized or erased, now reclaimed visibility. Collectively, they dismantled myths surrounding benevolence, exposing systems that demanded obedience while hiding behind constructed gentleness. Samuel's photograph became the centerpiece, radiating meaning stronger than any curated memory. Through careful research, the image had evolved from propaganda into evidence, from manipulation into honesty, from silence into a voice echoing fiercely across time. Visitors left carrying fragments of Samuel's truth with them. The investigator hoped those fragments would spread, altering perspectives, challenging assumptions, and ensuring future generations understood the depth of suffering woven invisibly through certain historical narratives. He stood before the photograph one last time, honoring Samuel's courage. The boy in the center no longer remained hidden beneath constructed smiles. His story, restored carefully and faithfully, now stood at the forefront where it had always belonged. The investigator whispered Samuel's name again, proud to speak it into the light. Through truth, persistence, and memory, he had given Samuel a place unshaken by time. The erased child had become an enduring legacy reclaimed from silence.